I want to introduce next our host for the program, our true host for today's program, my partner, Conrad Novak. Conrad joined our firm in 2006. He is a partner in the Chicago office. He has a pretty wide-ranging, impressive practice. Conrad handles construction catastrophes, healthcare, civil rights cases, products liability, a wide range of commercial litigation, very accomplished trial lawyer, and also a former non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. Every year, Conrad very graciously hosts our annual Veterans Day program, which is what today's program is. And Conrad has found some just incredible speakers for us today. And today is no exception. He's got another one. He's had one, a great one every year. And I'm going to let Conrad go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Welcome and thank you. Conrad?
Thank you, Josh, for the kind introduction. And as those of you who are attorneys and are trying to get CLE credit, I will start off by giving the first two of the CLE code that you need to have, and that is SM. We'll periodically break and give you the other CLE codes as we progress. But yes, thank you, Josh. Wow, what a guest we have today. Steve Miska. Steve served over 25 years in the United States Army as an officer. He is a graduate of West Point of Cornell University. And during his tenure, he served in the White House on the National Security Council as the director for Iraq. As many of you may have seen in recent news, we see what has happened in Afghanistan due to the U.S. withdrawal of forces there, and the issues specifically related with getting those who assisted our forces or government there as interpreters or working in other ways, getting them out and getting them to safety. And while for many, this may be something new that you're just learning about, for Steve, it's been and has become kind of the course of his work since he got out of the military and serving in the government. He has been an advocate for protecting our allies for many, many years before this was on headline news. And as a result of that, he has been very closely involved with many organizations related to these efforts. He's worked on efforts and is working on efforts currently now to help Afghan individuals and translators and others to get out. He is the author of Baghdad Underground Railroad that former General and CIA Director David Petraeus said should be on every American's reading list. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Steve Miska. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Conrad. It's such an honor to be here with you.
So something that I start off every program, every Veterans Day program, we're a little bit early. I welcome our veterans. Our firm has a lot of veterans serving across the country in different offices, and also those that are joining us who are veterans that aren't attorneys. We truly thank you for your service and the leadership role you take in your organizations and also in your communities. And I ask everybody, Steve, how did you walk into that recruiter's door? Tell me, how did your military story begin and why you decided to serve in the first place?
Sure, yeah, I was a young teenager in need of some structure, I guess to charitably put it. And my dad, when I was 16, talked about his experience in Vietnam, and he mentioned that he was really impressed by West Point officers and that maybe I should think about that. And I was growing up on a potato farm on Long Island, you know, our Polish heritage that we share in common. And I said, what's West Point? I had never heard of it, even though I was from New York, and it just hadn't been on my radar screen. And so as I started looking into it, fortunately I had the grades and everything and got a congressional nomination and got accepted and never looked back.
Yeah, and so briefly take us through the history of your service, and obviously we'll have some touch points on why what we're going to talk about today matters so much to you. But Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I went infantry. I figured, if I'm going to do this Army thing, which I really had no idea what I was getting into, but I figured, well, I want to go all the way. And so the first half of my career was pretty much jumping out of perfectly good airplanes in the airborne infantry, both in Panama as well as at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I was seriously considering continuing along those lines, but you mentioned General Petraeus. He was my brigade commander at the time, and he recommended that I consider going back to teach at West Point. And I thought, I wasn't really the best student first go around. Maybe this would be an opportunity to expand myself intellectually a little bit. And so I was fortunate enough to go to the Johnson School at Cornell and go teach economics for a couple of years at West Point. And when I came out, got posted in Germany, and that's as the Iraq conflict started up. And I got caught in the deployment do loop, I guess, if you will, and did 3 consecutive tours into Iraq for about 40 months total. And then came back to, after 3 combat tours in Iraq, I did 3 combat tours in a place called Washington, D.C. That was a completely different type of experience. And I was a counterterrorism fellow. I came back with this burning issue, though, from Iraq. Why, all of our closest Iraqi partners were being killed out from underneath us. And we didn't really have good policy tools to insulate them. And so I spent a year as a counterterrorism fellow just really turning that strategic problem over and looking at it from different angles and thinking about it and writing my thesis on it. And what I realized was it's a logical strategy that adversaries fighting from a position of weakness are going to target our soft networks, right? And the soft targets. And if so, we should have some sort of, policy options to counter that. But then I went to the White House, I went to the NSC, and I was director for Iraq, really focused on CT and counterterrorism and the security side of the portfolio as we were withdrawing. And so I recused myself from policy like the special immigrant visa and other things that were going on. I felt, number one, it was being handled well by the team there. And I was so personally involved with individual cases that I just felt I'd have a conflict of interest if I was involved in it. And, but then I went to teach at Marine Corps University for 3 years, and I got back into publishing and researching more on it, going to Capitol Hill and advocating for SIV legislation and other tools that were coming out and some of the legislation at the time. And then I retired, and my wife decided Southern California, she liked the weather out here better than Northern Virginia. And so we've been out here for about 6 years, and I've been in the nonprofit space that whole time.
If you could share for us as we kind of get into what a special immigrant visa is, I think before we get there, a little bit telling our audience on who these people are that are out there and what they do for us and the different types of things that they do for us. And if you'd be kind enough, sharing some of your own experiences and how this first became an issue for you.
Yeah, no, well, I'll point out the flag behind me. I'll slide over a little bit. Is a flag of Iraq. And as I got ready to leave in late 2007, the interpreters that still remained on the base at Forward Operating Base Justice, which was a small American enclave inside of a very large Iraqi base, all of those interpreters who were with us, because it was so lethal, they wanted to throw a farewell party because we had started helping people get out. And so they signed that flag and they gave it to me as a parting gift. And I hung it on my wall because I really did not want to write a book, but people kept encouraging me that the story needed to be told. And that flag was the inspiration, quite frankly, for me. When I walked in every day, it'd be the first thing I saw. And it would inspire me to keep writing, to keep working on it. Writing Baghdad Underground Railroad was a very different type of writing experience than publishing in academia. And so the publisher actually is a veteran nonprofit that helped me with that. But to get to your question on the types of people, so I tell many of their stories in the book, and we got about 36 out at the time. 2006 and 2007 was the height of sectarian cleansing in Baghdad. There were over 3,000 civilians being killed every month, which is, to put it in American context, a 9/11 style level of trauma every month, the 12 months leading up to when the story begins in the book. And so my interpreters were just being killed out from underneath me. And we didn't, the only thing we could do is help them remain anonymous, let them live with us 24/7, because if they commuted back and forth to home, it put their families at risk. And they used nom de guerres, right? They couldn't use their real name, because in Iraqi culture, if you know somebody's real name, you can trace back to their tribe and figure out where they live and where their family's from. So these were men, mainly young men, but there were some women as well that stepped forward and were taking tremendous risk to help us. And it wasn't always that way at the start. There was more idealism that I think drew people to us. But as the violence ramped up, the risks were really just crazy, and we couldn't do our mission without them. They were providing the contours of the culture for us to help us mitigate any harm, whether unintended or not, that we might cause, mitigate the cultural faux pas. And so I went on patrol with 2 interpreters at all times, because I didn't want to. My interpreter was a US citizen with a security clearance, so he could go into very sensitive meetings with me. But I didn't want to leave my soldiers without the ability to communicate with people, if I was stuck in a meeting for hours. And so the young Iraqis who were out there, the forward facing to the public with us, they were just, tremendous partners, and we couldn't have done our mission without them. So to really kind of finish this and put it in a perspective, a different perspective, I guess, for the audience, of the 36 that got here, at least 6 of them, as soon as they arrived in the United States, enlisted in either the US Army or Marines, and then deployed back to combat as American service members. And they were contributing in ways that no native-born American could contribute to. 2 of the guys served out their enlistment, went to work for a defense contractor in Tampa, and one of their last gigs was counter ISIS messaging on social media. I mean, you and I could not do that, Conrad. I mean, we could spend years, researching it, but we're just not going to understand it as well as they do. And so that's the type of value that they continue to add to our national security space.
And you mentioned 36. Just so people have perspective, you deployed 3 times to Iraq. Did you ever, on a subsequent tour, work with the same interpreters, or still see them and have the pleasure of kind of a continued relationship throughout your time there?
So one of the characters in the book that I write about is Ronnie. And Ronnie basically served his entire adult life in combat. He started working alongside of Americans at the age of 18. I met him in 2006 at Fob Justice in Baghdad, which Kadamia, which is a neighborhood in Baghdad, is a very sensitive religious area of the city. And so it required, a level of nuance that was pretty important. And Ronnie was just incredible and worked with our soldiers and was out there. But when he got approved for the special immigrant visa, the SIV, he came to me and he said, sir, I just want to thank you. We're really grateful that you did this, but I'm not going to go to America yet. And I thought he had lost his mind because it was so lethal. And he said, I just don't want to get there and have to be dependent on anybody. So I'm going to stay here and keep working and save up enough money so that when I get there, I'm on my own. And so I deploy back to Germany and start getting ready to cycle back to Iraq. And I show up in 2000, late 2008. And Ronnie emails me and he says, "Hey, sir, just want to let you know I'm still here. Had a couple setbacks." Well, what happened was he was working alongside of an American captain in the Army, and they had the same room together, and he was saving up his money in the room, but the room caught on fire, and all of his SIV paperwork and $10,000 up in smoke. So he had to start over. He had to get his passport again. He had to apply to at least petition the state to recreate his special immigrant visa and all that sort of stuff. And he wasn't even, it's funny, he wasn't even asking me for help. He was just reaching out and giving me an update. And so I said, "You need to come down here and work with me. I'm going to pull you out of bag. Let me talk to your unit and see." So he came down to Diwania, where I was, and some of the Shia southern provinces where I was operating. And the soldiers immediately fell in love with him because he, by virtue of just survival instinct, he has an amazing sense of humor. And while we were on patrol at any given time, Ronnie's cracking jokes, and I'm sure, I don't know how much of the audience is familiar with the military, but this, the command sergeant major was on our patrol, and Ronnie just was completely uninhibited in provoking the command sergeant major, and the soldiers just loved it. But anyway, yeah, he's one that really comes to mind.
Yeah. And obviously, we talk about interpreters, but there's obviously other roles, right? And as we'll kind of get into a little bit, the kind of categories of the SIV, there's other individuals that have worked with U.S. forces that are entitled to this process beyond interpreters. Could you describe at least what some of those roles might be so the audience kind of has an understanding who these individuals are?
Yeah, some of them are working on the logistics side. We go to war now with government contractors, defense contractors, and they're the ones that hire our local national partners and do all the vetting and bring them in. And we had more contractors than we had service members in our conflict zones. And so these are just incredibly valuable people who are working anything from technical capabilities that we have, and it could be span the gamut from intelligence to communications to logistics. And by virtue, it's really just the American affiliation or Western affiliation is probably more accurate, because a lot of our European allies face similar challenges with respect to their self networks. Our Australian partners, they are targeted, and so we just don't have good tools to insulate them, and that's where a lot of my nonprofit work stems from now.
Sure. And again, it's difficult for people to conceive what some of these harsh realities and dangers are, and certainly we don't mean to disturb the audience, but I guess the reality must be kind of told. I mean, what are the kinds of things that happen out there, with some sense of editing, but just so people understand what are the real risks to them and their families if they are outed, if you will, as somebody who is collaborating and assisting U.S. forces.
Yeah, so to this day, Ronnie does not use his real name. And I've done some programming on the book with him. And the reason why is because his family would be prime kidnapping and extortion targets should the wrong people find out that he is now an American citizen and here. Because people believe that, because he's an American citizen, he must be extremely wealthy. And so we're going to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from this guy. For really high value targets from the enemy perspective, they will start killing family members in order to force them to return. And so it gets pretty pretty bad pretty quick. At that time, everybody in Iraq knew somebody who had been killed, tortured, kidnapped, and the morgues were just overflowing. And it was happening both ways. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Sunni insurgents were intentionally targeting Shia marketplaces and searching for collaborators. And then the Shia militia, Jaish al-Mahdi and others, some Iranian-backed militias were intentionally going after them as well. Basically, they want to culturally blind us, and they recognize how that damages our ability to, accomplish our national security objectives. So there would be things like interpreters would not tell their families many times that they were working alongside of Americans, because not that they didn't trust their family members, but somebody might inadvertently slip. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, letters with a bullet inside them start appearing on the family doorstep stating, you better tell so-and-so to quit working alongside the Americans. And then it could progress from there. So there's the threats were real. They were a lot of, at that time, Iraqis would not even take like one cab across town to where they were going. It was like living in a James Bond movie. They would take a cab to a building, go into the building, walk out the backside, jump in another cab, and try to shake whatever tails were after them. And then some of the worst challenges, and some of these remain to this day, are the security checkpoints, where at that time in 2006-07, they really needed to be able to fake whether they were Sunni or Shia as they got questioned at checkpoints. Because and these might not even be legitimate checkpoints, they could be militia checkpoints, or there could be an army checkpoint or a police checkpoint that's being overwatched by militia, and they know the militia is watching them, and so they've got to behave a certain way. And so it was really complex space for them, and a lot of them learned the hard way very quickly.
And why do you think some of these individuals did it? Was it out of a sense of idealism, or believing that our efforts, right, and supporting our efforts would make for a better Iraq, a better Afghanistan, wherever the case may be, as opposed to, how much money they were making? Obviously, I don't think anybody would put their families at risk for any amount of money. So I think we can kind of get through that. But what were kind of the hopes and dreams? Obviously we're talking about people that want to come to the United States, right, through this program. But I think many of them, maybe even like Ronnie, but believe that he could make a difference in his homeland. What was your impression of some of those stories?
Yeah, so well, first, because I get asked this question a lot, I would offer that many are taking the positions for the same reason you and I would take a position, right? There are a lot of different variables that factor into that decision. And I think early on, absolutely, idealism was very much a part of it. It was, Saddam was gone, the repressive regime was on the run. And so there was this idealism. I'd also point out that there was no special immigrant visa for the first, 4 or 5 years of the conflict. And even when Congress first legislated it, they only allocated for 50 visas. And that was between both countries. I mean, you're talking 50 total when there are tens of thousands of people working with us. So because it had become so lethal, and the bureaucracy was Byzantine, I guess is a charitable term, we started advocating. Ambassador Crocker was a lead advocate for it, and other diplomats abroad, that we needed to expand this SIV legislation. We needed to broaden the aperture a little bit so we could have a better safety valve. I think a lot of people ended up quitting. because of the risks. You know, it became too much. We paid well relative to other opportunities that they had at the time. Unemployment was through the roof. And but there's a lot of variables that factor into that question, I think, and it kind of ebbs and flows too, right, with levels of violence and who you're working alongside.
Okay, and turning now to, I guess, the application process, right, which any of us here on this call who work with the federal government in any way or have to fill out any type of forms, sitting here comfortably stateside. Tell us a little bit about the process, the SIV application, the various checks that go on, and I did, so you know, Steve, circulate copies of those applications to our viewership here.
I'm sorry to the audience. I'm sorry.
But it's not a simple and easy thing. I mean, you need some letters and stamps from some pretty significant, important people, right, as far as operations are concerned. But as best you can, kind of walk us through what that would look like for an applicant.
Well, so first off, I will qualify. I am not a lawyer. I provide security advice to lawyers, yeah. And IRAP is the best in this space with respect to the International Refugee Assistance Project. They're the absolute experts in this space. But I'd also, you know, say any bureaucratic process that John Oliver can do a 15-minute segment on and make you laugh and cry at the same time. I mean, it's just that is the best way to encapsulate the experience if any of the audience members are getting ready to, you know, try to help a client work through this process. It's a 14-step process. Our government, because of what we've seen unravel in Afghanistan, the government has been attempting to streamline it. And quite frankly, when I was on the Obama administration, we were attempting to streamline it. We got up to just over 4,000 applicants able to be processed a month, which was, I guess, the height of efficiency. Right now, there are just in Afghanistan alone, over 20,000 principal applicants. And when you factor in family members, you're talking a population of over 80,000 who are still in Afghanistan. They were not evacuated. So there's, you know, just, you've got to get employment verification. You've got to show honorable service, right? So have letters of recommendation from your military counterparts or whoever the organization is that you worked with. And that's some of the streamlining that the Department of Defense and Department of State are working on right now. They've had a program called Project Rabbit that is using AI to help with the employment verification and some of the other verification checks. But then you've got pretty much every three-letter agency in our government gets involved with the security checks in the SIV process. And what I find so problematic about that in particular is if you look at interpreters, they are the most heavily vetted refugees anywhere in the world if they become an SIV applicant. They are getting polygraphed every 6 months when they're working with people like you and me out in the field. They're getting background checks and interviews by counterintelligence professionals. And so these are people we trust with our lives every day out on patrol. And it's almost like they start over at square one. It is, they do. They start, none of that factors in to the assessment process for the SIV. And so the bureaucracy is really Byzantine. It's basically managed between the Department of State, Justice, and Homeland Security. But as I mentioned, the entire intelligence community plays a role in the process. And by law, Congress required that every administration process a case not longer than 9 months. So they had, and no administration has been able to get there. Just the way the bureaucracy is structured is completely dysfunctional.
And I've heard you talk in other...
Conrad, could I take a moment and interrupt? Sure. Sorry. All right. We're about halfway through, so I would like to interrupt for the next CLE code, which is 04. I will put it in the chat as well. Thank you so much.
So on the topic of bureaucracy, if I recall correctly, you were involved with changing legislation, right, and making it more streamlined. And I have heard you speak in other contexts on the need, the absolute need for an interagency kind of task force, and now bringing us closer to recent events, the lack of that type of structure and what we're seeing now. Could you tell us a little bit about the work you did on the legislation, because it seemingly was working, I think, a little bit better in the past, and we encountered some difficulties. Can you comment on that for us?
Yeah, well, so I would just start, right, because the legislation, the special immigrant visa legislation that I've worked in, that's specific to immigration, but it tends to go through the National Defense Authorization Act, right, and be treated as a military thing, and it's absolutely not a military thing. And our immigration system doesn't work during normal times well. It's absolutely not suited to manage a crisis. And that's what we've been trying to do with the Afghanistan evacuation, is use tools in immigration that are bureaucratic and frustrating and slow to manage something that is extremely time sensitive. And so that's been a challenge. But from previous evacuations, what our coalition did, the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition, which I'm on the steering committee for, we teed up lessons learned and best practices from previous evacuations. Vietnam, where we evacuated 130,000 Vietnamese in a matter of a couple days, to Guam. And then the process began for onward resettlement to the United States through military bases that were used as just resettlement sort of points of contact as people got here before they went on to their final communities. And one of the best practices out of all of the other two evacuations were the Kosovar evacuation and the Kurdish evacuation. Two of the three went through Guam, a US territory. And what that affords is it provides the protections that our immigration law offers when we use a US territory. So anyway, that was what our coalition, mainly humanitarians and veteran service organizations, were advocating for, was to use US territory and not go to third countries which were not signatories to basic conventions of human rights. Because what would happen is that would have other second and third order consequences that I'd be happy to talk about. But anyway, one of the primary lessons learned was the Joint Interagency Task Force, right? And what all that is really is, in the military, we call it task organization. We take different parts and pieces of, in the government's case, departments and agencies, and we put them under the auspices of one entity, in Joint Interagency Task Force, that has presidential authority and then can receive congressional appropriations. And it allows that organization to manage the mission problem set outside of the normal sort of rice bowl politics that happen inside of a single department or agency. And so anyway, if we look at Vietnam as the example, our government stood up a Joint Interagency Task Force. At first, it was led by an ambassador, so state in the lead, but very much Department of Defense facilitating the evacuation. And then very rapidly, Health and Human Services sent Julia Taft, a very senior executive there, to lead the Joint Interagency Task Force. And then so state then took a lower role, and HHS led it because it was much more centric to resettlement here in the United States. And bringing in civil capacity, right, to augment the government organizations that are involved in receiving at that time, Vietnamese refugees. We still don't have that structure with how this administration has chosen to address the problem. It's a hybrid with state very much in the lead abroad at third countries and in Afghanistan, and Department of Homeland Security in the lead here in the United States. And what we've seen is just not enough capacity on either end, quite frankly, of the evacuation pipeline, and not the right capabilities that are needed to address the problem. And so that's where our coalition has offered our expertise and has offered capacity in many cases, both from the resettlement agencies as well as veteran service organizations. We've had 2 members of our coalition directly hired by the State Department to help manage the Afghanistan side of things with respect to just organizing continued evacuation, which does happen on a much lower scale under the radar and many times in cooperation with the current regime.
And, you know, on that point, when the current crisis in Afghanistan has come up, and you've touched on this a little bit, you sprang into action and worked with some near and dear friends to both of us through the Pacific Council and this network that you've described. Tell us, to get a sense, if you could share with the audience so they have a sense of what that effort looked like, the commitment to that effort, and how many people you were trying to assist, and some stories.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, as you mentioned, that when I finally realized that, well, let me just put it in this perspective. Our coalition, our steering committee, had been meeting maybe a couple times a week through the months of May, June, and then in July, it started to get a much quicker pace. And come August, we literally were meeting twice a day, 7 days a week, because things were going sideways so quickly. And I remember showing up to one of the meetings, which were at 7 a.m. Pacific time, which I consider a violation of my human rights, but you know, we were doing what we needed to do at the time. And I said, we really need a 24/7 capability, an operations center that can field the volume of distress calls that we're getting right now, both not just from Afghans, but from Americans and others who were advocating on behalf of Afghans, and they just had nowhere to turn to. Nobody else would pick up the phone. And everybody on the steering committee said, that's a good idea. And then the next day I showed up and I said, I'm serious, we really need this capability. And everybody said, yeah, good idea. And on the third day, a woman called me after the meeting and she said, you know, would you be willing to help? And very uncharacteristic of me, I snapped. I just said, I mean, what do I look like? I've got a day job. I've got all these other commitments. My publisher's got me on the road for this book. I mean, I don't have time for that. But after that conversation, I just sat and reflected and I said, you know, maybe she's right. Maybe I need to do something. Maybe the nonprofits that have all the resources don't really understand what this capability could provide. And so I called Jerry Green at the Pacific Council. He offered his entire downtown LA office suite. And, you know, Nell and I went and started recruiting. And I immediately got on the phone with a Team Rubicon founder. And Team Rubicon is a nonprofit that does a lot of disaster response. They hire a lot of veterans who have these skill sets to operate in austere environments. Because we knew we couldn't just accept any volunteers. It had to be people who had experience and were willing to stick it out. And so in our initial call for volunteers, it basically said, you need to be willing to quit your day job for the next 2 weeks, work 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. And even that, you know, we still got, you know, very well-intentioned people wanting to offer 3 hours on Sunday, but you just need consistent volunteers who are learning, they're getting the situational awareness of what's going on in Afghanistan, but also in third countries and transit routes and in the United States. Right now, we still have 8 military bases that are active with over 50,000 refugees on them here in the US. So there's a lot of complexity with many different organizations. And so we had a team of 20 people in person in LA working around the clock. And we were on the phone with everybody from 4-star generals calling us for help, senators' offices calling us for help, the BBC, high-risk security people calling us for help. I mean, it was just insane that the demand signals, and we are still active. We're not in person, we're in a virtual capacity, but at least through the end of the year. And we field 275 to 300 calls a week from either organizations that are attempting to help find safe passage for Afghans, or Afghans in need of some sort of advocacy or assistance. And right now we've got thousands in safe houses across Afghanistan. We've got tens of thousands abroad. And Human Rights First has a database of over 90,000 cases right now. And we're actively synchronizing we're coordinating with the State Department and the Department of Defense as some of the lower level activities continue to help people find safe passage.
And, you know, to the extent we can talk about it, the situation now, or at least recently, of people trying to get out, authorized, unauthorized, or off the books type of missions. I mean, there have been many stories of individuals that have a true commitment to this, that have Americans, that is, prior service members that have, you know, risked their lives and are quite possibly still risking their lives on going there and finding a way to get these people out. What was the climate like around the time of the withdrawal and shortly thereafter, and quite possibly now, on what the possibilities are for people who are still there to get out, formally or informally, as we might call it?
Yeah, so you know, as you allude to, the veteran community really became animated about this, and not just like our generation, right? Vietnam veterans were really excited. They didn't want to relive the fall of Saigon twice in one lifetime. They didn't need that trauma. And so what we saw was veterans raising millions of dollars, chartering aircraft, getting landing and overflight rights for aircraft, and bringing them into country and manifesting the people that they were trying to get out, and then flying them many times to third countries somewhere else, or to bring them close to the government evacuation pipeline, whether it was in Dubai or Doha or somewhere in the Middle East near the military bases. So that continues. But what I would say is it's been really rough space. I've had 24/7 psychiatric support lined up for my team since the first week. 9 times out of 10, they won't say no, but that's essentially how the conversation goes. You know, call us next week. And it's basically as they get a sense for the family or individual in question, you know, they just don't meet the triage protocol for referral to a safe house. You know, they're not a high enough target on the Taliban's hit list. And so it's really, you know, and these are people who want to serve, they want to help this population, and they've got to, you know, they don't have a lot to offer. But there are still dozens of veteran organizations in the Afghan Evac coalition that are very centric to what's happening in Afghanistan and are working to find safe passage to third countries. And we continue to get flights out in coordination with the Taliban and the State Department. And so that continues, but it's on a much lower scale. You know, it might be a few flights a week sort of thing, going to, you know, different countries, whether the Middle East or India or Albania or somewhere like that.
And I think it's important for the audience to know as well that the mere fact of getting out of Afghanistan, in this case, it doesn't stop there, right? I think we were speaking about a family or an individual that ended up in Doha, and through certain immigration and visa issues, could you share that story on how you might have a tragic outcome when you initially have some type of success or seeming success, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we hold on to those success stories, right? It's so important to emphasize the wins. But yeah, there was a case where Afghan male approved for asylum. He was physically in the state of Maryland, and his wife and 2 daughters, by some miracle, escaped Kabul in August, but not through our government evacuation, probably through one of the rogue veteran operations. I always call them that. They don't like the term rogue. But they were in Doha on a 30-day Qatari visa, and our ops center gets a call on day 28. I got a call from a senator's staffer and basically said, "Can you do anything?" They're getting ready to get sent back to Afghanistan, which if they were in the United States, that would be a violation of non-refoulement. You know, we would not be able to do that according to our law. But the Qataris are not signatories to the Human Rights Convention. So they were getting ready to get sent back. And the husband didn't know what to do. He just said, okay, because every day you overstay a visa in Qatar, there's a fee, an overstay fee. And then they'll incarcerate you if you don't pay your hotel bills and any other closing costs. So we begged them, don't let them return. Just keep them in Qatar, please. We'll figure out funding if we need to, but keep them in Qatar. It's exponentially harder if they go back to Afghanistan. And one of my colleagues, an immigration attorney from New York, with very strong connections in the DHS and USCIS, was able to identify that, oh, the mother and 2 daughters, their asylum cases were also approved. The paperwork is just stuck in DC because they don't know where to send it. Embassy Kabul is no longer, that was where it was going to go back to, and they didn't know where the family was. So I got Ambassador Holtz involved. She was actually called out of her, she retired 2 months previously and got called out of retirement to go manage the refugee crisis in Doha. And she got the Consul General involved, who ultimately, we got you have to physically have the paperwork with the clients. I guess we're not in the digital age yet. So by diplomatic courier, we got the case files shipped to Doha. They got their final interviews, and we finally got them reunited. But, you know, my point about that story is it's a no-brainer case, right? All the asylum cases were approved, but it's the bureaucracy that was failing us, and it required the highest levels of engagement in our government in order to fix it. And it's mystifying why it should be that hard.
Yeah. And in a moment here, we will open up the floor to some questions. So if individuals want to use the chat function to ask whatever questions you may have of Steve. But leading into that, because I have the power to see a question already, and that is, how can people help? You know, you've got a lot of lawyers on the call here, certainly, and veterans. What are some of the organizations where people can lend their skill, their time, their resources if they want to get involved with this issue?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. And the really good news story of this, if there's a silver lining, is that it's been amazing to see the response from the American public. In a nonpartisan way, right? That people have been reaching out to want to help. And so for the lawyers out there, I would highly recommend IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project. They do just really strong work in with not just SIVs, but vulnerable refugees across the world. I would also recommend, if that you've got anybody in the New York area in the audience, IARC, which is a collaborative of immigration organizations that work specifically to help arrivals coming into the New York area. I apologize, I'm not as familiar on the Chicago side. I do know what you can do is look up the 9 resettlement agencies, because they're always part of the process for resettlement. And the way, and so yeah, if you just Google resettlement agencies, you'll see there are 9 of them, and there'll be some that are specific to the Chicago area, maybe 2 or 3. And they're always a good source to reach out to. They will absolutely need legal assistance because the vast majority of people were paroled into the United States under humanitarian parole, which offers no legal status. And so they're essentially going to get stuck in the asylum system as opposed to get some other sort of status. Whereas special immigrant visa applicants will receive a green card and then be eligible to apply for citizenship down the road. But that it's an easier process for SIV applicants. I want to say we got just over 1,000 SIV applicants in through the evacuation. There were not a lot, and at the time, the number hit 20,000 in August, and there have been, I'm not familiar with the actual figure right now in terms of where the application pool is, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's grown because there were so many people who were eligible to apply. And now that the risks are so high, I can't imagine that the number will go down anytime soon.
And I will share with the audience that our colleague Josh Vincent, just in the chat box, did circulate information for the International Refugee Assistance Project for those of you that are interested in assisting. I'd be remiss if I didn't. One thing that we've talked about several times, Steve, is how veterans can kind of communicate with each other and how we can share with others this kind of credibility we can have when we have conversations, even if we might disagree with each other, even if we may be coming at an issue from different perspectives, and how in many ways we need that very much, not just on the issue we're talking about here today, but more broadly in our nation right now. And this brings me to your involvement in First Amendment Voice, a nonpartisan organization that I think is doing spectacular work on initiating and fostering conversation on very important issues. And since First Amendment and we're lawyers, tell us a little bit about what the organization does specifically in relation to this and more broadly as well.
Sure, yeah. So we cover the entire First Amendment. So as lawyers, that's pretty dynamic space. It's complex space, right? All 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. And we look at it through very different lenses many times, how technology is reshaping the way we express ourselves or practice our faith, or, the media landscape, how it's changing. And so with respect to, your question about veteran voices and this issue in particular, what we're trying to do is work with other organizations that are interested in letting veterans who right now have the capacity to be received across the ideological spectrum in many ways that other people are not, where people on the right and the left are at least willing to listen to us. And so we can have a conversation about why it's important to welcome our Afghan arrivals. And our hope is if we start that, maybe we can broaden the conversation to immigration writ large, because it's decades in the making that we need some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. And our polarized, political state doesn't seem to enable that to happen. And so what we're hoping is to really try to move the conversation in a direction that lets us help ourselves, really, as a country. It's in our economic interest to get immigration right, and it's reflective of our values. And I think both of those we see playing out here with the Afghan evacuation. And so anyway, that's the hope. But FAV, First Amendment Voice, does a lot of other programming, difficult conversations, and bringing very diverse audiences together who normally don't interact, and giving people the opportunity to just maybe drop their guard a little bit and have a discussion and see that it's okay disagree without publicly demonizing somebody. And that's where a lot of our programming stems toward.
Excellent. And as we wind down to the last minute here, minute or two, the last CLE code is CN. That is, again, CN. Steve, you're the author of Baghdad Underground Railroad. Where can we get the book? We've got to give people the opportunity where we can find that as we close out our program today.
Well, thanks. I mentioned that the publisher, it's a veteran nonprofit organization. It basically it's called the U.S. Veteran Artists Alliance, and they help aspiring veterans who want to be writers, want to be screenwriters, want to be cover artists, or whatever the passion happens to be. So the proceeds from the book support a really good cause, and it's on all of the online retailers, the major retailers, Amazon, of course, being the primary one. And that's where the publisher, I guess, tells me they get the most proceeds on their margin. So that's what I always refer people to, is the Amazon web link. And if you like it, we always appreciate good reviews on either goodreads.com or Amazon. It really helps people learn about the book. And I like to think it's an American story. It's not just a memoir from combat. It's not an immigration story. The last third of the book is focused on the sponsors who received these young Iraqi interpreters into their homes and welcomed them and help them reestablish their lives in a very foreign culture. So anyway, that's where the audience can find it. And thanks for asking the question.
And with that, Steve, first and foremost, I want to thank you for what you are doing, your mission, your life's work, and how you're helping so many people. Thank you for your service, brother, and thank you to all the veterans that are here today and joining us. We wish you a wonderful Veterans Day. And with that, unless there's any other final comments here from Josh, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Steve, I just also want to express our thanks on behalf of the firm and everybody who attended today. It was a riveting program. We really enjoyed it. That was helpful. It really gave us a great understanding of everything you've experienced and some of the things that we can do to help. So thank you.
It was an honor to join you, Josh. And of course, Conrad makes it easy. And so it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you at the next Hinshaw U CLE. Have a great Veterans Day all. Take care.